Hey, it's Jordan, and I am really appreciative to be joined by the Gray Zone's Ben Norton. We might have some tech stuff because he's in Bogota, Colombia, and the internet is not so great, but your voice is the most important thing. Um, I, I, I don't know if you've had a chance. I hope you're not torturing yourself, but literally watching CNN the last couple days is kind of like, I used to work in cable news, so you have producers in the control room talking to the host. I kind of feel like the CIA is telling the hosts what to say. So I wanted to get you in. You're right near Venezuela and an expert on Venezuela. So let's start with tell me what the conditions are in Bogota. You're covering some things there, and what is actually going on in Venezuela. Because if you believe Mike Pompeo, apparently there's a Cold War plot where Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, was about to hijack it out of there on a plane, and Vladimir Putin convinced him not to. This is what they sold to us yesterday.
Well, thanks for interviewing me, Jordan. Thanks for covering this because unfortunately, the coup attempt that just failed this week in Venezuela, it's gotten a lot of press coverage, of course, but it's been ridiculous, misleading press coverage, like most of the media coverage of Venezuela, which is frankly often lies or just complete exaggerations. And it's also really appropriate that this new military coup attempt happened when I'm here in Colombia reporting, because I'm here in Bogota, the capital of Colombia, to report on this event going on right now called Refugio Humanitario por la Vida, which means humanitarian refuge for life. And what it is it was organized by some left-wing groups and some human rights organizations here in Colombia who have brought together thousands of activists from across the country, from different areas known as departamentos, or like what we would call states, including some rural departamentos where you have campesinos, so peasant organizers, Afro-Colombian and indigenous organizers. And leaders of these groups have been murdered at a shocking rate. In fact, Colombia has the highest rate of assassinations of human rights activists out of the entire world, more than any other country. And of course, it's a close U.S. ally. Predictably, right now, Colombia has a far-right president named Ivan Duque, who's close to Donald Trump, and he's part of this axis that's helping to lead the coup attempt against Venezuela. So it's just hard to overstate the irony and the hypocrisy of the fact that the U.S. government, led by a far-right racist billionaire, Donald Trump, who calls Mexicans rapists and says that people from the global south are from shit countries, or like this is the guy helping to lead the coup in Venezuela, and he's working with, at the same time, people like Ivan Duque, the far-right president of Colombia, whose government is presiding over the worst crisis of assassinations in the world, and of course the Brazilian regime led by Jair Bolsonaro, who is another extreme right-wing, frankly a fascist figure. And we don't even have time to get into just how extreme he is. I mean, I'll just say really quickly that Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, he has praised the former fascist dictatorship in Chile of Pinochet. And his biggest problem with Augusto Pinochet, Bolsonaro said, the Brazilian president, was that Pinochet didn't kill enough people. So this is the crew that the Trump administration has assembled to try to launch this right-wing coup attempt in Venezuela, which is clearly a power grab for oil, for privatization, for looting the country of its wealth and its natural resources, for undermining and destroying all of the socialist programs that have been created in the country. Again, it's not about freedom and democracy, and you can look at the people involved, and that's very clear. And, I can talk more about the situation here in Colombia and the stuff I've seen, but I think maybe we could talk a bit more, because I know you wanted to talk about the coup attempt in Venezuela. That's in the headlines.
I also want to point out, and you'll know more about this, Bolsonaro in Brazil is also involved in a corruption scandal that makes Russiagate look like child's play. I mean, we both agree on Russiagate, and it's a distraction. So Bolsonaro, we're seeing a wide web of leaders that Trump is engaging in that decimate human rights, are engaged in all sorts of assassinations, violence, not to mention Trump is now supporting this potential new leader in Libya. So, but the media doesn't cover any of this. And what I think is so striking about Venezuela it takes you, Max Blumenthal, and others to actually, you're the only ones putting out video of the humongous amount of supporters of Maduro that are gathering around. All you see is this kind of contrived CIA, CNN framed image of the opposition and Juan Guaido as this hero. Can you kind of talk about, I know you're not literally in Venezuela, but you're plugged in. Is the whole country now against Maduro as that's stuffed down our throat by corporate outlets?
Well, as you know, Jordan, we did an interview that got a lot of attention a few months ago, right before I went to Venezuela. This is at the beginning of the coup attempt, which was initiated on January 23rd. On January 22nd, the Trump administration, specifically Vice President Mike Pence, personally called the coup leader in Venezuela, Juan Guaido, and told him to self-declare president. We know because of media reports in mainstream corporate media outlets like the Wall Street Journal and Reuters that numerous governments had been planning for weeks in what they themselves called a conspiracy. Like the media outlets, it was an actual conspiracy where these governments worked with Juan Guaido and the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, and they made plans that on January 23rd, which is an important historical date in Venezuela, marking a transition in democracy from military dictatorship. So on that day, Juan Guaido self-declared president, interim president, and immediately after, an hour later, the U.S. and its allies that had been planning this coup attempt recognized Juan Guaido as the supposed interim president. For anyone who's interested, you can check out the interview I did with Jordan. I go into great detail about the historical context in Venezuela. It's a great interview. It's really long. So I won't do that again here. I'll jump just to the coup attempt. So when I interviewed with you, Jordan, I was just on the verge of going to Venezuela. And I was in Venezuela for about a month, for most of February and the beginning of March, reporting there. And as you mentioned, anyone who's watching this can go to thegrayzone.com. That's with an A, the American spelling of gray zone. And we have a lot of reports from on the ground. And like you said, there were almost no other English language reporters there. There was one other reporter from Britain who did good work at Press TV, and now Press TV's YouTube channel has been shut down, and their Gmail accounts have been shut down by Google days after the Trump administration declared a branch of the Iranian military to be a supposed terrorist organization. So anyway, we've also seen the crackdown on any of these alternative voices by big tech companies. And speaking of that, Twitter has been helping this new coup attempt in Venezuela this past week that began, today's May 1st, so it began on April 30th, yesterday on Tuesday. And in this coup attempt, we saw 24 military officials. They seem to be mostly, there's a mixture, but mostly lower rank soldiers who decided to defect and join Juan Guaido and try to orchestrate a military coup attempt, like we saw in April 2002. Hugo Chavez, the previous president of Venezuela, was democratically elected, and in 2002 in April, there was a U.S.-backed military coup that briefly ousted him, although Chavez was so popular that masses of Venezuelans flooded the streets and demanded that he be reinstated, and he was reinstalled as the legitimately elected president. And the Bush administration had its hands all over that. Well, we're seeing a repeat of that, but the irony of it is that the Trump administration has been doing it in the open. Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and Trump all openly tweeted in support of this operation that they supposedly called Operation Liberation, which is ridiculous. And at the same time, what's also really ironic is that the coup attempt didn't even really go anywhere. It was extremely short-lived. They did not take any significant parts of the country. They took, at least temporarily, they took over a military base. But the one thing they did accomplish in this most recent coup attempt this week is that Juan Guaido and the soldiers, they managed to release a right-wing opposition leader in Venezuela named Leopoldo Lopez. And this name is very important, Leopoldo Lopez, because he is essentially the right-wing puppet that the U.S. has been trying to install. So Leopoldo Lopez, who is from an oligarchic family, extremely rich, in the context of Venezuela, white, like much of the elite. And he has been the leader of the kind of extreme right-wing opposition in Venezuela for years. He's been involved in numerous violent coup attempts, in acts of violence like the Guarimbas in 2014 and 2017, and many other things. Guarimbas where the right-wing opposition were taking over neighborhoods and making barricades in the street and then lynching people. And they actually set black Venezuelans on fire because they tend to be very racist. When they were alive, they killed Chavistas. They fought with the police and the government. So Leopoldo Lopez has been a major voice in this opposition, a major leader. The New York Times and the corporate media have whitewashed him, comparing him to MLK, which is just so insane.
Oh, God!
But it's so insane. They're comparing
I don't think
that burns black people alive.
I don't think MLK was from a rich family or burned anyone alive. But I digress. I wanted to follow up with you. I think.
Well, wait, quick note on this thing. So the reason I mentioned Leopoldo Lopez is so he's been involved in much of this violence. It's extremely well documented. He's openly called for military coups, and he was at first imprisoned, and then there was all this international outrage. So then the supposed dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro, the elected president of Venezuela, they, under pressure from all these international groups, they agreed to release him from prison and instead put Leopoldo Lopez on house arrest. So for the past few years, he's been in house arrest. And during this coup attempt, which completely failed, although you couldn't tell that from the corporate media reporting, which portrayed it as if it was somehow successful and had a mass base of support, which it did not. But anyway, one of the few things they did accomplish in this coup attempt is they managed to release Leopoldo Lopez, and immediately he fled inside. He was in Venezuela still. He fled to the embassy that Chile has in Venezuela, and Chile said that they would provide diplomatic support for him. And he was staying there, and Chile, which has a right-wing president right now, was waiting it out to see how the coup would actually happen. And when the coup failed miserably, Chile decided that it would be a diplomatic disaster to keep him in the embassy. So they said that he had to leave because they had too many guests. So then Leopoldo Lopez went to the Spanish embassy. And as far as we know, he is currently living in the embassy of Spain in Venezuela. And for context, for people who don't understand that's the worst, maybe aside from the U.S. embassy. It's probably the second worst embassy you would go to. Spain colonized Venezuela and murdered countless Venezuelans. And Simón Bolívar, the great liberator, the nationalist hero who in the early 1800s, the late 1700s and early 1800s, liberated Venezuela from Spanish colonialism. The country, everyone, even the opposition, often sees Simón Bolívar as their national hero. So that symbol says everything, where the U.S.-backed coup mongers release the violent right-wing coup leader, and he flees to the embassy of Spain, which colonized Venezuela, and asks for its protection.
It's like, you can't believe this is real life. I wanted to ask you, because I believe I read this at the Gray Zone, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there quite a long trail that shows that Juan Guaido and the, quote, opposition are actually trained by the U.S., and there's State Department money and other things? I mean, it kind of reminds me of like what we did with Mossadegh in the 1950s and other countries. Isn't there U.S. involvement in training the opposition on how to, quote, free Venezuela? It seems to me, you're the expert, to be nothing more than a U.S. CIA / Department of Defense operation to essentially put in, as you're calling it, a puppet. You don't see that on CNN, but there's a money trail here to the U.S. as far as Guaido, and who has already indicated he wants to privatize much of Venezuela.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is the question, and the answer is, of course, that yes, as you just implied, that the U.S. has spent many years and many, many millions of dollars funding right-wing opposition groups in Venezuela. Leopoldo Lopez is part of the same party, in fact, that Juan Guaido is. It's called Voluntad Popular. It's the most right-wing of the opposition parties, the most extreme. It's implicated in violence for years now, not just recently, for years, and multiple coup attempts. And what's really wild is that, as you mentioned, my colleagues Max Blumenthal and a friend of ours who's a great journalist, Dan Cohen, published an article at the Gray Zone, a deep dive looking at the history of this guy, Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido, for instance, who's only 35 years old, 81% of Venezuelans had never even heard of him before the coup attempt. And we know that because of a poll that was done before the coup began on January 23rd. And that poll was done because Juan Guaido had just become the president of the National Assembly, which is controlled by the opposition, which won it in an election and then proceeded to violate all of these laws and fight with the Supreme Court and refuse to abide by Supreme Court rulings. So it's been in contempt of court, and there's been a fight over that. But anyway, so 81% of Venezuelans had never even heard of this new president of the National Assembly, and he was the one who was chosen by the U.S. to be the so-called interim president. Now, Venezuela had a presidential election, in fact, in last May, and nearly a year ago, and it was a fair election, but the main three right-wing opposition parties voluntarily boycotted the election, and we have quite a bit of evidence that suggests that that was probably at the request or really the demand of the U.S. Specifically, Mike Pompeo met with some opposition leaders and said, don't participate in any democratic processes, because the U.S. knew that the opposition in Venezuela is very divided. And there are multiple parties that were vying for votes, and they would split the vote against Maduro, and they would lose. So the U.S. just said, don't even participate. Instead, just boycott it, and then we'll say that it was a stolen election. Even though it wasn't a stolen election, they just voluntarily boycotted it. So the U.S. has its hands all over this. And going back a little bit more, so I mentioned the article my colleagues wrote at the Gray Zone. One of the shocking things that they reveal in this article is that in 2007, Juan Guaido, who was in his 20s at the time, and who was just a right-wing opposition activist, he was part of a crew of right-wing opposition activists who went to Serbia, and they trained with this group Canvas, which is the Center for Nonviolent Strategic Studies, something like that. Canvas is an acronym. And this was this group that's been involved in color revolutions. You know, they call color revolutions, which is where after the destruction of the Soviet Union and the restoration of capitalism in the Eastern Bloc, some of these governments still had kind of social democratic, left-oriented governments, and there was a series of color revolutions, which were ostensibly nonviolent, although some were violent, revolutions or just coups against the governments that then installed pro-Western governments that then became members of NATO. And Canvas in Serbia, which was part of Yugoslavia, which was destroyed through a NATO war that was backed by Bill Clinton at the time, Serbia became a major hub, which became a member of NATO and a major hub for a lot of these opposition groups. And the Venezuelan opposition trained in Serbia at this group Canvas, which is funded by the U.S. government. So we know directly that Juan Guaido was trained by groups funded by the U.S. government. We also know from government documents that for years now, for nearly 20 years, because Hugo Chavez was first elected in 1998. So the Bolivarian revolution process in Venezuela has been going on for a little over 20 years now. And we know that at least early on in the Chavez years, that the U.S. was spending tens of millions of dollars per year. The estimates range, but the average estimate's around $50 million per year funding right-wing opposition groups in Venezuela. So, you know, I could go on and on. The U.S. has its fingerprints all over this, but I'll just conclude really quickly by mentioning this other note that, as I said earlier, we know that the Bush administration was deeply involved in the 2002 military coup in Venezuela, which uninstalled the elected president, Hugo Chavez, and briefly installed an unelected right-wing businessman who was trained in the U.S. and worked in the U.S., named Pedro Carmona. We know that the Bush administration had its hands all over that. And we don't even need to do deep digging for this most recent coup attempt, because the Trump administration just openly admitted on Twitter that they were involved in this coup attempt.
Right. Who, by the way, you probably didn't see it, but Bolton yesterday during his press conference, I mean, John Bolton talking about peace is like Dick Cheney selling, Boy Scout or Girl Scout cookies. But Bolton said it's clearly not a coup. I wanted to ask you because obviously we live in this 24/7, Cold War reenactment. It seems that the messaging now, it's coming from CNN, the New York Times, and not really Trump himself, but Bolton and Pompeo, is this is now a battle between U.S. and Russia over Venezuela. I mean, I don't know if it's true. I doubt it is, but Pompeo just said on CNN, yeah, Maduro was about to get on the tarmac and fly to Cuba, and Putin talked him out of it. I was like, you're going to push back on that, Wolf? Rhetorical question, obviously. But it seems that the U.S., to kind of sell this to the American people, they're trying to make it into a Russia wants Maduro in there. So I wanted to ask you, what is fact or fiction here? Russia doesn't want a coup by the U.S. in Venezuela, but it would seem that makes sense. Why would Russia want the U.S. to basically steal Venezuela's oil and get more geopolitical control?
Absolutely. I mean, this is just one of the most ridiculous lies. It's just so obscene. And as you mentioned, John Bolton is by no means a human rights angel. This is one of the architects of the Iraq War. He has the blood of a million Iraqis on his hands. He has the blood of countless other people on his hands. I mean, he's like an extreme warmonger, a diehard neoconservative, and a liar. That is a complete lie. It is absolute fiction. Now, of course, no one would dispute the fact that Russia supports Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the few countries in the region that has an independent government, that does not have a kind of puppet U.S.-backed government. So if you look, what happened in the late 90s and the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, was that there was something that people called the pink tide. There was a wave of progressive governments that were all elected and voted in Latin America. In Chile, you had Michelle Bachelet. In Argentina, you had the Kirchners. In Brazil, you had Lula and Dilma of the Workers' Party. These are all elected leaders, except Colombia. Colombia always, where I am right now, it's always been the exception, a very right-wing country, extremely violent country. But most of these countries, Paraguay, they had progressive elected governments. And over a series of U.S.-backed coups, the U.S. and right-wing forces in the region, like the oligarchs in each country, were able to work together to often undemocratically oust these governments. Now, to be fair, in Chile and Argentina, they were probably free and fair elections. But in Brazil, there was a kind of legal coup that ousted Dilma and installed this unelected right-wing extreme neoliberal Michel Temer, which then led to Bolsonaro. And we now know that the judge, Sergio Moro, who led the supposed anti-corruption campaign against Lula and Dilma, the leftist presidents in Brazil, that judge was working with the CIA. And we know that because he was promoted to Bolsonaro's justice minister. So Bolsonaro, the fascist, rewarded him for imprisoning Lula and impeaching Dilma. And a few weeks ago, both Bolsonaro and Sergio Moro, the judge who oversaw the anti-corruption campaign, met with the CIA in CIA headquarters in the U.S. So they're not even hiding it. It's all in the open. So Brazil is the most egregious example. Then there's a military coup in Honduras. There's a soft coup in Paraguay. Anyway, the point is that all of these governments, in Ecuador, there was a free and fair election, but the former leftist president, Rafael Correa, he finished his term, and they had a new president come in who was working with the U.S., working with the CIA. He handed over Julian Assange to Britain, and that's completely illegal because Assange was made an Ecuadorian citizen. So, we could talk all about that for hours. I'll end there, but the point is that we had this wave of only ones that still remain are Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, which happen to be the countries that John Bolton called the troika of tyranny, the only left-wing governments remaining in the region. And Russia, not because it's the Soviet Union anymore, not because it has a leftist government, but because all the other governments in the region are right-wing and they're pro-U.S., Russia looks at the region and sees, okay, well, the only countries that have an independent foreign policy and that would be able to, have good relations with us are those countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So portraying this as if they're somehow colonies of Russia is insane. Now, okay, certainly Russia is now buying Venezuelan oil, but that's not necessarily a sign that Venezuela is controlled by Russia. This is just ridiculous Cold War fear-mongering. And again, it's an example of, like Russiagate was, of how the U.S. government and establishment forces are trying to use the memory of the Cold War and the kind of connotations people have about the Cold War, and then trying to use that to justify things today, even though it's completely different. I mean, I would argue, and I have been arguing, we are in a new Cold War, but it's very different from the old Cold War. The old Cold War was a series of proxy wars between socialist governments and capitalist governments. This is not even, now it's simply a matter of competition between the U.S. and the other two great powers that are challenging the U.S., which is China and Russia. So instead of acknowledging the complexity of what's happening, and instead of acknowledging the key role the U.S. has played, not just under Trump, but under Obama, in trying to reassert control over the region, over Latin America, and undermining and ousting these leftist governments, instead of acknowledging all that, they just blame it on Russia, which is just a simple boogeyman that can help people turn off their brains and can just play off of these stupid Cold War stereotypes.
Well, not to get into like a game of presidential predictions, but if the new boogeyman is Russia, can't this be used? Let's say right now the polls say Biden is up very big. I don't really buy all of them because they're undersampling young voters, but put that aside. Let's say Bernie gets momentum. Can't the media and establishment Democrats then put out this, Russia is attacking us again, and they're pushing pro-Sanders stuff because they want Sanders to be the nominee? Can't that be used? It seems like anything now can be strategically used. In any anti-Russia, Russia is attacking us, Russia is trying to save Maduro. Can it be used against pretty much any progressive forces, in this case, Bernie Sanders? Because I've been predicting, wait for it. Wait for them to start asking, wait a minute, why did Bernie and Jane Sanders go to Russia on their honeymoon? Who did they meet with? I mean, you might be smiling, but I don't think we're so far away from this, because they'll do anything to stop, forget Sanders, but anything progressive, and obviously that would indicate Sanders in 2020.
Well, they've already been doing it. This is not something that we can speculate about. It's actually happening.
And I should mention Tulsi Gabbard as well. They've obviously had an orchestrated attack to not only black her out, but to basically make her seem like a Russian stooge.
Yeah, they're doing the same thing to Tulsi because she criticizes U.S. wars, U.S. regime change, which has been completely catastrophic, which has devastated all of the regions that it's been carried out in, and has led to a lot of blowback here in the U.S. and Europe and the rise of far-right forces. So if you talk about that, then you're a Russian stooge, which is the smear they're using against her. But the crazy thing is they've already done this to Bernie Sanders. And Bernie, he has some good views on some international issues. He's taking leadership in Yemen. But for the most part, he doesn't really speak a lot about international issues and war. It's not really his specialty. But they're still going after him for it. So you mentioned the fact that he went on his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. There's been multiple articles about that, implying that he's some kind of Russian stooge, a useful idiot of the Soviet Union and Russia. We've already seen the Washington Post, which I jokingly call the Bezos Post because it's owned by Jeff Bezos, the richest man on the planet. And we saw the Washington Post publish an article, a ridiculous article, claiming that Russian bots were supporting Bernie Sanders during the 2016 presidential campaign, and basically trying to imply that there was not real popular enthusiasm, that the people who were excited about the Bernie campaign were just being used by Russia. So of course we're going to see that again. And we also saw it in the most comical fashion. We saw these stupid memes from the Internet Research Agency, which is supposedly this Russian bot farm. We saw in a report produced by the U.S. government or produced for the U.S. government that was funded by the U.S. government, we saw them listing all these memes. And one of the memes that the Daily Beast and all these media outlets went with was a meme of a buff Bernie Sanders, of like a cartoon of Bernie Sanders with no shirt on. He's like super buff and ripped. And they use that as supposed proof that Russia was trying to manipulate the election on behalf of Bernie Sanders because of this stupid buff Bernie meme. So we already have seen it, and it's been ridiculous and stupid, but it's going to get worse. And Bernie and his supporters have to be prepared for that because, fortunately Bernie didn't play too much into Russiagate, but because, you're always under attack, he's always under attack, and anyone who criticizes the mainstream is always under attack from neoliberal establishment Democrats. He did sometimes concede and play into it a bit to try to weaken some of the attacks on him. But you're going to realize, he and his supporters are going to realize that you can't give these people anything. If you give these dishonest smear artists anything to work with, then they're going to continue to use that against you. Mm-hmm. Because now they're going to say, oh, well, Bernie admitted that Russia was attacking our democracy and now they're helping him. So it's going to be hard. But fortunately, I think the thing is the majority of Americans don't care at all. They just don't. They think Russiagate is stupid. There is like a small percentage of the population that's obsessed with it, but I think they're mostly neoliberal coastal elites who were the people who loved Hillary Clinton, so they're not going to vote for Bernie anyway. Mm-hmm. So we're going to see media smears, but we already saw a lot of media smears, and I think most people who like Bernie Sanders, they're the people who hate the media anyway. Right. So I don't think it could help him, but it might not hurt him.
And my last question is, you're in Colombia right now. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it correctly because I just sound stupid. But obviously the focus has been on Venezuela, and justly so. Why should people watching care what's going on in Colombia right now? How does it affect America? How does it bolster the military-industrial complex here? And what is Trump and his administration trying to do? We know in Venezuela it's about the oil. What is their interest in Colombia?
Well, Colombia does have oil too, but not at the same level as Venezuela. Colombia has a lot of natural resources like Venezuela. Both countries have a lot of minerals, gold, other natural resources, and that's a big issue here in Colombia. So anyone who's interested can follow my reporting. I'll be publishing some videos in the upcoming weeks at the Gray Zone, and I'm working on translating, and because the thing is, I'm doing all these interviews in Spanish, so it just takes a long time to edit them. But the thing is, in Colombia, I've been interviewing here some indigenous activists, some Afro-Colombian activists, some women's rights activists, and they all basically say the same thing. Most of these people are from more rural areas, and there has been more than 550 assassinations of human rights activists since November 2016, since the government signed a peace treaty with the FARC. The FARC, this is a complicated history too, I won't go into it, but the FARC was a revolutionary socialist Marxist-Leninist group that launched an armed uprising over 50 years ago against the Colombian government during the Cold War. There were many guerrilla groups in Latin America at the time, many socialist and communist groups. They were inspired by the Cuban Revolution and other things like that. And they launched an attempt at a guerrilla war to have a communist revolution in Colombia. And they had a war for over 50 years in which the U.S. government helped the far-right Colombian regime mass murder people. There was a horrible civil war where the government and the government-backed right-wing paramilitary groups and death squads were responsible for 88% of civilian deaths in the Civil War. So almost 90% of the civilian deaths. And then the communist guerrillas were responsible for about 12% of the civilian deaths. So massive discrepancy, although they're portrayed as supposedly these terrorists. And anyway, so what happened in November 2016 is the communist guerrillas signed a peace treaty with the government. And supposedly the government was going to stop supporting these far-right death squads and paramilitaries that have been killing people. Well, the government said it would stop, but the deaths have continued. And since that peace agreement, in which the FARC handed over all of their weapons and became a legal registered political party here, Since November 2016, more than 550 activists have been killed, including many former members of FARC who were supposed to have political neutrality and were supposed to, be able to be protected by the government. Many of them have been assassinated, and then many members of the indigenous community, the Afro-Colombian community, peasants, and a lot of these people that are being killed. And when I've been interviewing members of this community, they're the ones who are talking about the fact that multinational companies, multinational corporations, largely from the U.S., Europe, and other places, have been trying to take over their communities to take their natural resources. And people say it, I don't even have to ask about it. I've been doing so many interviews, and people say it again and again and again and again and again. They say, our community has these resources, it has gold, it has whatever, and companies are trying to get access to these resources. And whether or not the companies are doing it directly or indirectly, paramilitary groups that are linked to the Colombian government are being paid money to murder activists to help them get access to these natural resources so they can exploit them and make money. I mean, obviously it's all about making money. It's all about, corporate profits, which is how capitalism functions, and that's how politics functions in the U.S., it's how it functions here in Colombia. So, I mean, there's a lot more I could talk about there, but the point is that this country has the worst crisis of murders of human rights activists in the entire world, but you virtually never hear that in the U.S. media. No one talks about it. Instead, Colombia is portrayed as a kind of model in Latin America. Like, it's right next to Venezuela, which is supposedly a failed state, which it most definitely is not a failed state. It has difficulties, and those difficulties are largely the result of the U.S. policies. So a recent study published by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a progressive D.C. think tank, and this study was authored by two leading economists, including Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot. Their study found that the U.S. sanctions against Venezuela in 2 years, between 2016 and 2017, resulted in the excess deaths of 40,000 Venezuelans. That's essentially mass murder. It's just because it's through sanctions and it's not through bullets, it's not as gratuitous, so people don't talk about it as much. But anyway, so while the U.S. is responsible for creating this political and economic crisis in Venezuela, insofar as one exists, there's no discussion of the actual humanitarian crisis going on in Colombia, which is a country with extreme poverty, extreme inequality, extreme racism, extreme misogyny. It has all of these issues. And, I came here with Code Pink, with Medea Benjamin, and we came here to report on what these human rights activists have been going through, because the rest of the U.S. media is not going to do it.
Well, if I know one thing, where Medea Benjamin goes, action goes with her. So that's awesome. I hope you get some sleep, and I hope you stay safe, because we need more Ben Nortons out there. I personally know this is thankless work domestically, so it's even more so when you're in another country and you're editing videos and translating. So thank you for taking the time. I hope we could stay in touch as things develop. And I think you made a good point. We only care about humanitarian aid in Venezuela when there's things that we could get, but it sounds to be even worse. Way worse in Colombia, but there's nothing mentioned there, maybe because the returns aren't as grand as in the case of Venezuela. So thank you, Ben. TheGrayZone.com?
Yes, TheGrayZone.com, and you can find on YouTube, we have all our videos.
And by the way, I just want to make a point, as I tell Status Coup viewers, don't depend on YouTube to notify you when I'm live. Don't think it's going to be so easy to find Ben and Max's work. Google is deranking outlets like Ben and Max, and Aaron Mate has done great work there. So bookmark it and put it in your phone or whatever. You have to take the step of going to the site every day, because it's not going to be so readily available. This is the corporate Big Brother society we're living in now, between Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. I just want to make that plug for you, because I think people kind of are living in this kind of pre-suppression, pre-censorship era, where it's, if you type in Venezuela or Colombia, Ben Norton will show up. Not so much the case. So I think that's an important point. Thanks again, and we'll stay in touch.
Of course, Jordan, and thanks for interviewing me and giving a platform to other journalists who are actually doing real journalism. Thanks.
Take care, man.
See ya.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.